Okay, so for next time, you're doing Jeremy Bentham's essay, The Principle of Utility, and you're going to give me 3 words submitted to the vocab folder, right? I do want to warn everybody a little bit about the Bentham essay. It's short. It's only about 5 pages, but it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to read than most of what you've been given in this class, right? Now, this isn't... what was I going to say? It's not because the ideas in it are all that complicated, but because it's written in like early 19th century expository prose. So the sentence structures are a little complex, and some of the vocabulary is going to be a little bit arcane, right? So just go slowly, be careful, identify subjects and verbs if you have to, and look things up when you don't know what they mean, right? And again, we'll talk you through it on Tuesday anyway, right? But yeah, just so you know as you're reading. The other thing I do want to note is that class is going to meet online on Tuesday. I'm getting my second COVID vaccine on Monday, and I didn't react very well to the first one. So I'm guessing that I'm probably not going to feel great. I will probably be well enough to teach, but not well enough to actually come into work. So we will still be having class, but we'll be on Blackboard.
Which one did you get?
I got the Pfizer.
Okay. I'm having to get one Saturday, and I don't know which one I'm getting.
Yeah, I mean, the Pfizer and the Moderna are both a 2-shot vaccine. They're about equally effective. I think the only major difference is the Moderna, the cooling off period is a week longer before you can get the second shot. You can get the second Pfizer shot in 3 weeks. You can get the second Moderna shot in 4.
I think we're doing the Pfizer. The one that's 3, she said 2 or 3 weeks we have to go back in April.
Yeah. And then I think, the Johnson & Johnson it's only 1 shot, but it's not as effective as the other 2. Okay. So, before we begin talking today about Gandhi, I want you guys to just kind of take a minute and do a little bit of thinking and writing. Try to answer the following question. Right. To what extent do you think how much we have, right? How much stuff, how much money, whatever, is related to our sense of morality, and why? And just go ahead and keep pondering until I tell you to stop.
Are you still writing?
Yep.
For this? Okay.
Yep. take 2 more minutes. Okay. So who wants to go first? All right.
I don't think I'm not reading yet, but I don't think I understood, but not, I don't know, I'll just read.
Okay.
How critical harm does affect our sense of morality, but it may vary for different situations. Those who start off less privileged than others, but come into a great deal of materialistic stability, are stereotyped to appreciate and are grateful for what they have. On the other hand, those who have never lacked for anything are stereotyped to be more inclined to take what they have for granted.
Okay.
In other words, the amount of stuff you have or obtain in life has an effect on who you are. Not stop right there.
Okay, so you're making a distinction here between earned and inherited wealth, right? And talking to about like where, like you're saying that where you start out makes a difference. Okay. But I noted that you also used the word stereotype in here, which suggests that while we tend to think about these categories in certain ways, that they're not absolute, right? That there are going to be exceptions to the general rule in both. So one thing you're doing there that's really good and smart is you are kind of qualifying your answer in various ways, right? You're limiting the claim that you're making to try to make sure that it actually sort of covers the cases you really want to talk about. Good. Rachel, what did you put out?
Okay, so I said I think the more people have, the more selfish they can be. People assume that the more you have shows how much you earn. Like, I want to be as successful as them. But with the nice stuff, how polite are they? Are they willing to give all that up? I think people who have a good sense of morality don't have a lot of stuff. They just appreciate what they have instead of worrying about what other people have.
Okay.
People with an abundance of things probably don't respect people or don't treat them as their equal. They just want to have it all, and they also worry about like making more.
Okay. So I see that you're not making a distinction here between earned and inherited, right? You're just talking about kind of like the end result here, right?
Yeah, just people in general.
Uh-huh.
I've seen it both ways. So where people
Sure.
who have a lot, they don't really respect, or they kind of demean people like in a lower position.
Okay.
Like the CEO will disrespect the janitor type thing. and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Versus while people who are like the janitor, they respect everybody because they don't have a lot. They're just appreciative. So.
Okay, so that wealth can be something that is potentially alienating, that potentially cuts us off from our feelings for other people and our kind of community feelings.
Right.
Okay. And I'm not trying to say that either of you is right or wrong here. I'm just basically trying to gauge the point that we're starting from here.
I feel like you did better, Grace.
No, you both actually you both wrote what you thought. You both addressed the question, right? And the fact that you don't necessarily think the same thing is not a problem, right? It's just kind of a starting point for discussion.
I just didn't really understood. Like, I thought I understood what, like, a sense of morality was, but then I was writing this and I was like, I don't know what he's asking me.
Okay, well, then that's maybe a good thing to try to dig into as well, right? If we're not entirely sure about what the terms we're talking about mean, then that's something we got to discuss too, right?
Yeah.
To figure out how to get everybody on the same page here. So, what do we think morality means? What does it mean to be moral?
I know, as I was like, kept looking out, like reading the question, I was like, okay, I have morals. I guess standards that I live by.
Okay.
Which I live up to.
Like how we are as people.
Okay, yeah, we think of morality as a kind of set of standards of behavior, right? Some people live by a particular religious code, right? Other people, live, simply by kind of ethical code that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the religion, right? But yeah, when we talk about morality, we are usually talking about a certain standard of behavior, right? And it's a standard of behavior that we define as good, right? When we talk about moral behavior, we're generally talking about behavior that we think is good, or is like, kind of like in the best interest of ourselves or of society, right? Because there are some moral systems that actually stress taking care of the self rather than taking care of others, right? So I don't know if either of you are familiar, for example, with the novelist Ayn Rand and her system of objectivism, right? Where the best thing you can do is focus on yourself and develop yourself. Now, I personally think that Ayn Rand's system is something close to what the Dungeons and Dragons game calls neutral evil. We can talk about that another time, but moral systems tend to involve like what we regard as good or bad standards of behavior, right? And these themselves can vary across cultures and even across individuals. So, the big question that Gandhi's essay is dealing with, right, is whether economic progress is related in any way to moral progress. Now, is he talking, do you think, from the sense you got of this, about individuals or about entire cultures?
I think it's more broad. I don't think he's as an individual or I don't know if I can do it personal.
Okay.
I think it's like, I don't know, a general thing, like everything.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, he's talking about the development of a society rather than of an individual. Thank you, yes. I don't know why I got tongue-tied on that. I think that's absolutely right. I think it might help if we, as we're looking through this, connect it back to certain other things that we have read. So I'm just going to note here that we will hear echoes in this of Martha Nussbaum's essay, which we read long, long ago now. Education for Profit, Education for Democracy. in which Nussbaum's basic argument, right, was that education that is geared towards advancing economic growth in a country tends to neglect the subjects that would actually make students better participants in a democracy in favor of teaching them technical skills and obedience, right? That the things you need for just making a country richer, the skills you need for making a country richer, are different from the skills you need to make a country more democratic and more just, right? We are also going to hear echoes of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Although what Gandhi is doing is, in a lot of senses, he's working with similar materials, but what he's doing is often quite different from what King is doing. And we're also going to see some connections here to Confucius. Particularly in thinking about the relationship between riches and morality and between law and morality, right? So let's take this back to what we talked about last time when we were talking about justice and trying to come up with a definition of it. What do we remember from last time about what we decided justice meant or justice was?
It was getting what you deserve.
Yeah.
That was like one of our main things, but we couldn't really go more into it.
Yeah, that was the main idea that we settled on, if I recall, right? And you can break this down in a couple of ways, or we can come up with legal definitions of justice, right?
Okay, I meant to ask you
Yeah.
that day, well, it was Tuesday. Avenge and revenge. Like, is there a difference between those two words, or do they sound like?
Avenge, think avenge, A for active, right? Avenge is what I'm doing.
Doing two.
Yeah. To avenge is an action, right? Revenge is the thing that you've done, right? So revenge is the thing you're trying to get, right? Avenge is the active thing that you're doing.
Like, why were we,
So think of one as a verb and one as a noun.
like, why were we talking about it Tuesday? I was supposed to think like avenge. Like,
Okay.
I think that was the word we were trying to think of, but we just
yeah, like avenge.
Uh-huh. Yeah, to avenge yourself upon someone is to get revenge. Although avenge often has a more positive connotation than revenge does, right? Revenge we tend to think of as negative, right? So that's another difference between the words as well, in terms of kind of shading there, right? That we associate avenging yourself on someone with getting justice, right? With, defeating someone who has done you wrong, right? Whereas revenge, we tend to think of as something a little bit more petty, right? You got the last Snickers out of the machine, and I will get revenge. Or the machine ate my dollar and didn't give me the damn Snickers. I will get revenge upon it, right?
you better start hitting that machine to give you your money back.
Yeah, you never do your money back.
I'd be so mad.
But yeah, so we think of like in legal contexts, in social contexts, and even in sort of workplace contexts, right? Now, Confucius's idea of justice is that it is tied into the needs not so much of what the individual deserves and what the individual needs, but what the community needs, right? Confucius is mostly concerned with forging links and forging ties within a particular community. So what is just is that which benefits everyone, not necessarily what benefits the individual at a given time. So just keep that in mind as we are reading Gandhi and we try to figure out what is going on with Gandhi and his particular definition of justice, right? So there are two things going on in the background here that I think we need to consider as interpretive context for this. The first is the legal status of India at the time that Gandhi is writing. So 1916. Does anybody know anything about the history of India? Nope, nothing at all? Okay, no worries, right? So, starting in the 17th century, India is largely ruled by a corporation, a British corporation, right, called the British East India Company. Are either of you familiar with the story of the Boston Tea Party?
Yes,
Right.
also, I remember when it was, that you put that on your line.
Oh, we've talked about this before?
No.
Oh, okay, good. Because I mentioned this in a lot of other classes too, and I always forget who I've told it to and who I haven't, because I'm poorly organized. Yeah, so the British East India, those were British East India Company ships that the Sons of Liberty boarded and hurled the tea in the harbor, right? So the British East India Company basically had a trade monopoly with India, and they propped up puppet kings in various parts of the country, right? So they ruled kind of de facto rather than by law. Now in 1858, most of the Indian subcontinent is placed under direct rule from Britain, right? So Parliament in London is making rules for India now. This is largely because the British East India Company pushed people too far, and Indian military troops revolted in 1857 and killed a lot of British military and civilian personnel. Parliament says, all right, you guys are mucking this up. We're coming in and taking over now. So at the time Gandhi is giving this speech, India is a British colony, right? It's a subordinate nation within the British Empire. Now, after 1858, right, prior to 1858, the British mostly just kind of justified their colonization efforts in terms of profit, right? They're looking to make money. Now, that's still what they're doing after 1858, but they attach it to a message of sort of bringing the light of civilization to the dark places of the world, whatever that means, right? And to them, civilization means industrialization, capitalism, and Christianity. So essentially what they are trying to do is make many of these places look more like Britain, right? Believing that in so doing, they are doing a good thing. They're doing these people a favor. People like Gandhi disagree. And much of this is caught up in this historical idea that we call the myth of progress. So before we get into what the myth of progress is, what does the word myth mean? What do you think a myth is?
Something that's not real.
Okay, yeah, so in common conversation, usually that's what we mean, right? Like something like, oh, that's just a myth, right? That's something that's just folklore. It's like a commonly held perception that is untrue, right?
Right.
But the word has a more specialized meaning as well. Have either of you studied myths in other classes? Or mythology?
Like Greek mythology.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that context, what is a myth? they're stories usually about gods and heroes, right? And sometimes, they're explanatory stories. They explain how some state of affairs came to be, right? Or some, natural phenomenon or whatever, right? But what myths really are narratives that promote cultural unity. Right? This is the way most scholars understand the term now, right? So a myth is a story. And it's a story that sort of expresses an idea that ties a culture together, right? So to give you an example of this, do either of you know what Manifest Destiny was?
I've heard of it. It just slipped my mind. That was whenever they had there's something to do with Christianity and stuff like that, all that was going on, or
Okay.
I've heard the term before though, I've learned it in high school.
Okay, probably an American history class, right? The basic idea here was there was a pervasive belief in the U.S. in the earlier part of the 19th century that that kind of really continues even in some quarters into the present, that God had singled out the United States for a special purpose, and that part of that purpose was that the territory of the United States was to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? So our manifest destiny as a nation was to cover the continent, right? Now the problem with this in the 1830s, when this idea was really gathering steam, was that a very, very large part of Mexico happened to be in the way. So President James K. Polk provoked a war. We took over really the entire what's now the entire southwestern United States from Mexico, and all in pursuit of this particular myth, this particular cultural ideal, right? That was meant to, the whole idea really was kind of a narrative story about American destiny that was used to kind of define the culture of the time, right? To tie people together. So myths are these kinds of large shared ideas, right? These large shared stories. Or even, you might even think of, like if you want to think of this in terms of a simpler narrative, right? The story of the first Thanksgiving, right? Where the Pilgrims in Plymouth and the Wampanoag Indians sit down and share a meal together and live in peace ever after, right? Now, we do know that there is a lot of untruth in that whole situation because peace with the Wampanoag only lasted about half a generation. By the time Massasoit, the chief who had guardedly welcomed the Pilgrims, died, relations between his sons and the colony broke down, right? So, but we still have this founding myth of the first Thanksgiving, right? This joint harvest festival as this narrative of America as this kind of new peaceable, bountiful kingdom. So this is what we're talking about myths, right? Not to belabor this any further. So the myth of progress really is two separate ideas. The first is that things only get better as time advances. Right? That is, that each era in history is an advancement on the one that came before it, right? Now, if we want to think about truth and untruth, right, we can find plenty of historical examples to prove that this isn't really accurate, right? That absolutely civilizations backslide, right? That it is absolutely possible for one historical era to be worse than the one that preceded it. Right? We could even just looking at the history of the Roman Empire, right? There's that brief period of glory followed by centuries of decline. The second element of this is that technological and economic progress make life better for everyone. Right, that as technology advances, life gets better. And yeah, this is, perhaps, this strikes us as perhaps an overly simplistic notion, right? That, for example, ignores, say, the polluted skies and rivers caused by the Industrial Revolution, right? That ignores even in our present circumstances a lot of the social divisions that have been caused by people living in technological bubbles, right? So this is one of the ideas that Gandhi is grappling with throughout this whole essay, right? He's grappling on the one hand with this history of British colonialism, but he is also grappling with this myth of progress, right? Where even several people in his country are buying into this notion and arguing that, well, we should take what the British are offering because that will make us richer and thus will make things better, right? So let's try to was there anything in particular, before I start digging into this, in this essay that you guys wanted any particular points you wanted to note or that you wanted to ask questions about?
So he did give this speech because I was reading it and it was saying that like his stuff didn't get like published until after his death.
Yeah. So this wouldn't have been published until after he died, but he did give this speech in 1916 to this group of economists.
Okay.
And that's one important thing we might want to consider here, right? Is who the audience is. Right, so he is speaking to a group of Indian and British economists. Now, if we look at the first paragraph, we're going to get a volunteer to read for us the first paragraph, starting with when I accepted Mr. Kapildeva Malavaya's invitation. Thank you.
How do you pronounce that?
Kapildeva Malavaya.
Okay. When I accepted Mr. Kapildeva Malavaya's invitation to speak to you upon the subject of this evening, I was painfully conscious of my limitations. You are an economic society. You have chosen distinguished specialists for the subjects included in your syllabus for this year and the next. I seem to be the only speaker ill-fitted for the task set before him. Frankly and truly, I know very little of economics, as you naturally understand them. On the other day, sitting at an evening meal, a civilian friend deluged me with a series of questions on my crankism. As he proceeded in this cross-examination, I being a willing victim, he found no difficulty in discovering my gross ignorance of the matters. I appeared to him to be handling with a cocksureness worthy only of a man who knows not that he knows not. To his horror and even indignation, I suppose he found that I had not even read books on economics by such well-known authorities as Bill Marshall, Adam Smith, and a host of such other authors. In despair, he ended by advising me to read these works before experimenting in matters economic at the expense of the public. He little knew that I was considered past redemption.
Okay, thank you. So does this introduction echo at all any of these past things that we've looked at? Does it sound at all familiar in his mode of address here?
I feel like it should, but it doesn't.
So he's talking here to a specific audience, right? let's think back for a second to King in the letter from Birmingham jail, right? Now, Gandhi's writing a good bit earlier, so it's really King echoing Gandhi rather than the other way around, right? But in the introduction to that letter, what is King doing to establish his relationship to his audience? What is King's relationship to his audience?
He's pastor's like them.
Yeah, exactly. So he is establishing membership in their group, right? He's stressing what they have in common, right? I am one of you. I am an insider, not an outsider.
I was just about to say, I can see like the outsider, insider.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
In this.
Yeah. There is the same insider outsider binary, right? But is Gandhi setting this up the same way?
Not really. Instead of him including himself, establishing entrepreneurship, he's admitting that he's not well informed in economics.
Yeah, he's calling himself the outsider here, right? Stressing his lack of connection to the discipline and his lack of knowledge of its theoretical basis, right?
Whereas King was like, as debunking the idea of being an outsider. In his context, he's admitting to being an outsider or embracing outsider.
Yeah, do you think it's an admission or embrace? And why?
I think it's more of an admission than an embrace, because I guess because he starts off by saying that he doesn't know, and then he tells the story about how the guy kind of calls him out on it. So I think he's admitting it.
Okay. Let's look at the last sentence here where he calls himself a sinner past redemption. What does that mean?
I don't know. I feel like it would mean like he sins even after he redeemed himself. Like that's how I see it, but that's more in a biblical context, not really in this.
Well, he is specifically using religious language here. He's using biblical language, right? So a sinner who is redeemed has to repent, right?
Yeah, ask for forgiveness.
Yeah. So what is he suggesting he's not going to do?
So he's not going to ask for forgiveness for not knowing what he, like...
Nope.
But see, that's what throws me off. Like, if someone's giving me a presentation, or even like you teach in class,
sure.
I really don't know anything about this, but here we go. And I'm looking like, should we be learning from you then, or listening? If you don't really know anything about what we know.
Yeah. So why might he be doing that as a conscious strategy? What is he suggesting about what he thinks of their field of study?
He may be respecting them, like saying, I respect that y'all know this much, and like wanting to learn from it, maybe.
I was thinking more that I was trying to think of like something that we read before, how they rhetoric, how they didn't like value that as important. And maybe he's like the same way, like economics is not really important, so he's not asking for forgiveness about not knowing it.
Yeah, he's not going to ask forgiveness about not knowing it because he thinks it's bullshit.
Yeah.
That's so stupid to me, like...
Well, and I think as we get to what the main argument of the essay is here, right? The reason he thinks it's bullshit is because he thinks that economics is encouraging people to value the wrong things, right? That all of these people who have all of these theories, right, and these mathematical models are ignoring the moral and spiritual dimensions of life and of distribution, right? That economics doesn't really have much to say about the thing that he's more interested in, which is, again, like human moral progress, right? And I think we can get some more sense of this if we we keep moving a little bit in the essay here, right? Can you read the second paragraph for us, Rachel?
Yeah, I can.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My experiments continue at the expense of trusting friends, for there comes to us moments in life when about something we need no proof from about. A little voice within tells us you are on the right track. Move either to your left nor right, but keep to the straight and narrow way. With much help, we march forward slowly indeed, but surely and steadily. That is my position. It may be satisfactory enough for me, but it can in no way answer the requirements of a society such as yours. Still, it was no use my struggling against the guy's name. I know that he was intent about having me to engage your attention for one evening. Perhaps you will treat my intrusion as a welcome diversion from the trodden path. An occasional fast after a service of a sumptuous feast is often necessary, and as with the body, so I imagine is the case for the reason.
Okay, thank you. So, once again, like talking about that whole insider-outsider thing, right? King insisted that he was an insider because he was invited, right? How is Gandhi dealing with the notion of having been invited here? Does being invited make him an insider?
No, it makes him an outsider in his context because he doesn't know or doesn't respect what they do.
Yeah, I mean, he uses the word intrusion, right? He considers he says, he calls his own address to the group an intrusion, right? As a welcome diversion from the trodden path. Now, there's something funny about calling an intrusion a welcome diversion, right? Because what is an intrusion by definition? Yeah,
I mean,
but you can't define the word by just repeating the word, right? Yeah. An intrusion is by definition unwelcome, right?
Right.
Someone is an intruder because you don't want them on your property. Because they're not allowed to be there. But there's an irony here as well when he talks about himself being an intruder in front of a group of partly British economists, because they're also intruders in his country, right? Remember that, he is also an activist for Indian national self-determination, right? And he's talking to both people who belong to the nation that has colonized this country and others who have adopted their ideas, right? So when he talks about the economists he says he hasn't read, Mill, Marshall, Adam Smith, right? It matters that these guys are all British economists, right? His rejection of them is also like part of his rejection of Britain as a colonizing power. And his rejection of the doctrine of economics generally, right? Now, what does he rely on rather than economic theory in his thinking? If we look towards the beginning of the paragraph here.
You're talking about the expense of trusting friends?
Continue on a little further.
Oh, the little voice within us.
Yeah.
So like our subconscious.
Okay, well, our subconscious we're not aware of, right? The subconscious is kind of what Freud thinks is going on beneath our conscious thoughts that still drives those conscious thoughts, right? What does this sound more like, right? Like a little voice that tells us you're on the right track, move neither to your left or right, but keep to the straight and narrow way.
Yeah, I went outside, like religious. This thing, like, that just seems, yeah, like, that's, I don't know, that's like an illusion. Sounds like me alluding to the Bible.
Yeah, the straight
and
narrow way is a biblical illusion, right? And note that most of the direct religious allusions he makes, even though he himself is Hindu, most of the direct religious allusions he makes are Christian, right?
I think he just appealed to because
Absolutely.
it's an audience full of, he said, diverse people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think he's, but there's Indian comments too.
There are.
Okay, so yeah, but more than likely the majority is British economists, so he could put it in the problem.
Yeah, and think about also what the British Empire believed itself to be spreading in India, right? They're also trying to promote Christian ideas. And one of the things that Gandhi is pointing out is that a lot of the things that they are arguing for actually seem to run counter to the things that Jesus actually says in the Bible, right? So, I want to step quickly from here to page 403 when, he quotes the question that's being asked by the Economic Society running the event. It's, does economic progress clash with real progress? Now, how does he then assume economic and real progress are being defined? What does he think economic progress means in this context? Yeah, the fact that it's opposed, like even by the economists themselves, right, to real, right? Economic versus real progress, right? If something's real, right, we tend to think this is something that's true, right? Actual, factual, concrete, like this table. Is it real and undeniable fact? Unless you're one of those philosophers who doesn't believe in the reality of the material world, in which case it's something else. But we won't go there. But yeah, the real we relate to the true, right? So if economic is being opposed to real, then economic progress is being admitted, even by the economists themselves, to be somehow unreal, right? Now, economic progress, he says he assumes that that means material advancement, right? Essentially, a nation getting wealthier and more comfortable, right? Real progress, he assumes they mean moral progress. And this is where we get into that issue that I raised at the beginning of the class, right? The question that I asked you to ponder and to write on, like whether or not economic progress and moral progress are actually related to each other. And what does Gandhi's answer to this question seem to be?
I skip a few things. He asked,
Yeah.
like, does not moral progress increase in the same proportion as material progress? Like, shouldn't there be?
Uh-huh.
I guess like on the same place.
Yeah.
Progress at the same time.
Yeah, and that's his rephrasing of their question, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so what he's saying is like, I think this is what you're really asking, right? If we look down at the bottom of the page here, 403, right? Now let us take a few illustrations. Rome suffered a moral fall when it attained high material affluence. So did Egypt, and so perhaps most countries of which we have any historic record. The descendants, kinsmen of the royal line and divine Krishna, too, fell when they were rolling in riches. We do not deny to the Rockefellers and the Carnegies possession of an ordinary measure of morality, but we gladly judge them indulgently. I mean that we do not even expect them to satisfy the highest standard of morality. So, when he is pointing to these historical and real-world examples, does he see moral gain in wealthy societies or among wealthy individuals?
He's actually pointing out that it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
In every case,
Mm-hmm.
material after it's been great, and then they fall each time.
Yeah, that in fact, when you work on building up material comfort, material wealth in a nation, there is a falling away from spiritual and moral values, right? So let's look at the example he gives. Can I get somebody to read on page 404, the paragraph that starts with, "The question we are asking ourselves this evening is not a new one." Thank you.
The question we are asking ourselves this evening is not a new one. It was addressed to Jesus 2,000 years ago. St. Mark has vividly described the same. Jesus is in solemn mood. He is earnest. He talks of eternity. He knows the world about him. He is himself the greatest economist of his time. He's succeeded in economizing. Time and space. He transcended them. It is to him at his best that one comes running, kneels down and asks, "Good master, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said unto him, "Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. Thou knowest the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness, defraud not, honor thy father and mother." And he answered and said unto him, "Master, all these have I observed from my youth."
Okay, we pause there for a second, right?
Okay.
So, this guy agrees that he's done these things, right? And what do all of these things add up to? These things that Jesus has just told him he has to do. What are they basically? They're commandments, right? Yeah, they're things that we regard as good, right? But basically what this guy has done is follow the rules, right? He has followed all the rules laid out in the commandments all his life, right? Never broken a law. Right? Good for you, buddy. And then, Rachel, can you continue for us from, "Then Jesus beholding him loved him and said unto him."
Then Jesus beholding him loved him and said unto him, "One thing thou lackest, go thy way, sell whatever thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. Come take up the cross and follow me." And he was sad at that saying, and went away grieved, for he had the greatest possessions. And Jesus looked around and said unto his disciples, "How heartily shall they that have riches enter the kingdom of God?" And the disciples were astonished at his word. But Jesus answered again and saith unto them, "Children, how hard is it for them to trust in riches to enter the kingdom of God? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle rather than a rich man who can enter the kingdom of God."
So were either of you already familiar with this parable?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
I don't remember the book, but I remember the parable.
Yeah, it's a familiar one, right? It's one that's cited very frequently as an example of typical Christian moral teaching, right? But the lesson here is what exactly, right? Can the young man actually achieve eternal life? Can he transcend this existence just by following the rules? What else does he have to do?
He has to give up all of his possessions, like, to be pure.
Yeah, and this is actually a pretty common thread in a lot of world religions, right? It's particularly strong in, like, say, Buddhism. This notion that, your connections to worldly things in the material world weigh you down spiritually. And that the more stuff you have, the more wealth you've accumulated and haven't given away, the harder it is for you to transcend this life, right? In whatever way that particular religion explains that, right? Whether it's going to heaven or being reincarnated in a higher form, or, in Buddhism, right, the goal is to not be reincarnated anymore. Right? The goal is to get out of the cycle of reincarnation, so that you don't have to keep coming back. So, you achieve moral perfection here through renunciation, right? That's what Gandhi is arguing here. Through renouncing worldly goods and worldly treasures and worldly wealth. Now, this isn't the same thing as simply like being dirt-ass poor and accepting it, right? He says in the previous page that grinding pauperism, yes, is morally degrading, right? He is making a distinction here between men like, he cites on the next page, on page 405, right? The greatest teachers of the world, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, Nanak, Kabir, Chaitanya, Shankara, Dayanand, Ramakrishna, were men who exercised an immense influence over and molded the character of thousands of men. The world is the richer for their having lived in it, and they were all men who deliberately embraced poverty as their lot. Now, you don't have to know who most of these guys are. The first three, I'm sure, are familiar. The rest are founders of, they're either Hindu sages or founders of other Indian religions. Nanak, for example, is the founder of Sikhism. But what is Gandhi saying they all have in common? Apart from simply being great teachers.
They embrace poverty.
Yeah, they voluntarily embraced poverty, right? So renunciation is associated with spirituality and wisdom, right? Now, there are two other elements that I want to pull out of this. There are other related binaries that we want to discuss here. Look at the bottom of page 405. I just want you to read the first couple of sentences down to, this does not put an end to all material ambition. And I want you to tell me if you can see a binary expressed here that relates to time and history in some way. Just looking for two words that are opposites that relate to time and to history.
Are you referring to ancient and modern?
Yes, we are.
What word?
Ancient and modern. And then what words does he associate here with modern and with ancient?
Modern, materialistic, ancient, ideal.
Yeah, ideal. And then is there something he says after modern that is a little bit more similar to ideal than materialistic is?
Materialistic praise.
Praise, yeah. So let's think about what these two words mean, right? What is an ideal? If we hold something up as an ideal, what does that mean?
It's something everyone wants or everyone strives to do.
Yeah, okay, it's something aspirational, right? It's something that we hold up as a goal, right? What about a craze? What's a craze?
I think of like a trend, like something everyone's trying to do.
Yeah, so,
Like if it's interesting, it'd be TikTok. Like,
okay.
Trend or fad.
Yeah, trend or fad, good. And what do we know about trends and fads?
Fade.
Yeah, they're short-lived, right? They're temporary. Now, the word craze, I think, here is important as well, because what word is craze derived from? Crazy, yes. So the very word itself suggests behavior that's irrational, right? So this ancient ideal we can associate with these notions relating to time that he associated with Jesus, right? Eternity, transcending time and space, right? These things that have come down to us from this ancient past, right? These things are timeless. Whereas this materialism that he sees infecting India by way of Britain now is a temporary, short-lived, irrational thing, right? It's this spiritual wisdom, this moral wisdom, that is the enduring and eternal thing that stretches back into ancient times. So, if we had to come up with a definition of justice from this, how might we do that? How might we say Gandhi seems to regard, what does he seem to think is just? What does he seem to think the people he's talking about deserve?
I don't think it's more so legal,
Mm-hmm.
social. I think he said he deserved the ideal or the moral progress instead of like the pseudo progress that we believe, chasing the craze.
Okay.
Crazes and the short-lived things.
Uh-huh.
We deserve to want more, I guess. More than
Okay.
just like temporary things.
Okay, that we deserve these eternal values, and that these eternal values are the product of ancient wisdom and reflection, right? So it might also help us if we think about where he thinks these modern ideas are coming from. Does he regard them as coming from within India? Yeah, these are...
They're coming from outside.
Yeah, so I think part of the definition of justice here as well has to involve not imposing one set of cultural values on someone else, right? On outsiders not coming in. And I think like this kind of makes, I think, there's an intentional irony in his opening paragraphs, right? Where he says like, I'm an intruder coming in to tell you about the nothing I know about economics, while making it clear to the audience throughout that they know nothing about leaving India to develop on its own, right? Well, they know nothing about, the traditions of this ancient civilization, right? Okay, so we're about out of time. Do either of you have any questions about anything?
Okay, I do have.
Yeah, shoot.
It's just about his word choice. Okay,
Uh-huh.
this is on page 406 at the very end. He said he concludes his examination by these pregnant remarks. I've never heard or saw anyone use pregnant remarks.
Okay,
What does
pregnant.
that mean?
So pregnant remarks mean a pregnant remark leaves something implied but unstated, right? There's something else inside it that you have to draw out.
Okay, now I understand.
Yep. But it's metaphorical. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when we look at Bentham next time, Bentham is going to be coming at this issue of economic and moral progress from the opposite direction. In fact, Bentham's ideas are the foundation for some of these economic ideas that Gandhi is pushing back against. So we'll look at that for next time, and we'll see you online on Tuesday.